The alarm went off at 4 in the morning. Daniel Mercer didn't slap it silent the way a man who hates his life does. He reached over calmly, pressed it down with 2 fingers, and lay still for exactly 30 seconds, just long enough to remember where he was, just long enough to breathe. Then he got up. The kitchen light was the old kind, the kind that flickered once before it caught, casting everything in a pale yellow that made the room look like a photograph taken a long time ago. He set the water to boil. He laid out the bread on the cutting board sourdough from the bakery on 5th, the one that sold day-old loaves at half price if you came after 6 in the evening. He had learned all the rhythms of cheap things. The day-old bread was better anyway, he thought. Stordia, held together when it needed to. He made 22 sandwiches every morning, turkey and sharp cheddar, roasted chicken with a smear of Dijon, egg salad with dill, which his daughter, Lily, said smelled like the ocean. He wrapped each one in wax paper, marked them with small handwritten labels in his careful print, and packed them into the red cooler he'd had since, before everything fell apart. The kitchen was quiet, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of the knife. Daniel was 36 years old. He had the kind of face that used to be easy, the kind that smiled without effort, that trusted rooms when he walked into them. That ease was still there if you looked, but it had gone deeper, like something that had learned to stay out of reach until it was sure of its welcome. His hands were steady when he worked. His eyes moved carefully over things. He had the attention of a man who had learned that details matter, because once they had, and once he had missed them, he didn't dwell on that. By 5:15, the cooler was packed and sitting by the door. He moved down the hallway and pushed open the second door quietly. Lily was 8 years old and slept with the abandon of children who still trust the world to hold them. One arm was flung out over the edge of the mattress. Her hair had come loose from its braid during the night. Daniel stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went back to the kitchen, wrote the note he wrote every morning. Cereal is on the counter. Mrs. Halloran comes at 7. Be good, love, Dad, and propped it against the sugar jar where she would see it. He picked up the cooler. He locked the door behind him. Outside, the city was still gray. The street he lived on was 3 blocks from the bus line and 6 blocks from the building, where he set up his folding table every morning at 6:15, just to the left of the glass entrance doors of the Whitmore Group Tower. He had been doing this for 14 months. The first week, the security guard had told him to move. He had moved. Just far enough to be technically off the property. Just close enough that anyone going in or out would still pass him. The second week, a building manager had come out with a printed notice about solicitation. Daniel had read it carefully, noted that it applied to the property line, adjusted his table by 11 inches, and thanked the man politely. By the third week, no one came out anymore. He wasn't loud. He didn't have a sign with flashing lights or a speaker playing jingles. He had a folding table, a red cooler, and a small chalkboard that said, "Sandwiches. Fresh. $6. Some mornings he sold 15. Some mornings he sold 8. On rainy days, the number went up, because people in a hurry sometimes wanted something warm and ready in their hands. He had one rule for himself. The last sandwich stayed in the cooler until noon. He never sold it, even on the busy days when he could have. He kept it aside. And if someone came by at the end of the morning who couldn't pay a courier on a rough week, a woman he'd seen sleeping near the parking garage twice, he would hold it out without making it a moment. No one had ever commented on this. He hadn't told anyone about it either. That was the kind of man Daniel Mercer was. The kind who did things without needing them witnessed. The morning the rain came sideways, Claire Whitmore was already in a bad mood before she left the car. Her driver, Marcus, had learned not to speak during the last 2 blocks of the morning commute, unless she initiated. He had learned this in the first week of working for her, after she had calmly informed him that silence was a professional courtesy, not rudeness. He had not taken offense. He had simply adjusted, as good people adjust when the information is delivered cleanly. The Whitmore Group occupied the top 11 floors of the tower on Madison. Claire's office was on the 42nd floor, with a corner view that on clear days revealed the particular blue of the Hudson. She had not looked at the view in several weeks. There had been other things. She was 41 years old and had built the company from a consulting firm her father had started and half destroyed through optimism and poor bookkeeping into something that now managed assets across 4 continents, employed close to 3,000 people. She had done this through precision, through a willingness to have difficult conversations that other people avoided, and through a quality she rarely named but which people who worked with her recognized. She did not pretend, not about numbers, not about people, not about herself. This quality made her effective. It also made her lonely, though she would not have used that word. She would have said particular. She was particular about who she allowed close. Currently, she was allowing no one close, because someone close had tried to take the company away from her. The details of it were still assembling themselves in her attorney's offices on the 38th floor. What she knew was this: there was a coordinated effort involving 2 members of her board and at least 1 external entity she had not yet identified, to manufacture a compliance crisis significant enough to force a leadership review. She had discovered the first thread 6 weeks ago. She had not told anyone except her chief legal counsel, a lean, careful woman named Patricia Holt, who had worked with Claire for 9 years and was the closest thing Claire had to a confidant. Patricia had said, "We need more time and we need to be very careful." Claire had said, "Then we'll be careful." But careful had a cost. And the cost was that she was carrying it alone, and it was heavy. The car stopped. The rain hit the window in a long diagonal sheet. "Miss Whitmore," Marcus said, "should I pull forward to the Prostons? It's fine." She opened the door herself. She always opened her own door. People who waited for doors to be opened for them became people who waited for everything. The rain was immediate and cold. She had a coat, but no umbrella. She had left the umbrella in the car yesterday evening and hadn't thought to retrieve it. She walked quickly, head slightly down, heels sharp on the wet pavement. She was 10 feet from the glass doors when the man stepped forward. She registered him, the way you register a variable that shouldn't be in the equation: sudden attention, recalibration. He wasn't blocking her path. He wasn't aggressive. He was just there, standing beside a folding table with a red cooler, wearing a dark jacket with the collar turned up against the rain, and holding out something wrapped in wax paper. "You look like you could use this," he said. His voice was quiet. Not tentative. Just quiet. The way a person is quiet when they're used to saying what they mean without dressing it up. Claire stopped. This was unusual. She didn't stop. She moved through the world with trajectory. People and things moved around her, but something about the simplicity of the gesture arrested her. No pitch, no flattery, no performance of generosity. Just a man in the rain handing her food. She looked at him. He looked back. Not deferentially, not with challenge. Just steadily. "I'm not hungry," she said. "Okay." He didn't retract the sandwich. He didn't apologize for offering. He just let the response sit there. She found herself looking at the sandwich. Sourdough. Something inside she could see the edge of dark bread, the corner of white paper. The neat fold. It was wrapped with the kind of care that meant the person wrapping it had been thinking about the person who would receive it. She took it. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have an explanation for why she took it. She simply took it and walked through the glass doors. And she did not look back. But in the elevator, going up to the 42nd floor, she stood with the wrapped sandwich in one hand and her wet coat dripping on the marble floor, and she felt strange, not moved, exactly, but disturbed, in the way you're disturbed when you encounter something that doesn't fit the model you have of how things work. No one, in a long time, had offered her something with no angle. She ate the sandwich at her desk at 10:15, between calls. It was very good. The next morning, Claire arrived 4 minutes earlier than usual. She told herself this was because she wanted to review the overnight reports before her 8 o'clock. This was true. It was also not the entire truth. And she was honest enough with herself to know it. The man was there. Same table, same red cooler. He was talking to a young man in a delivery uniform. counting out change for him. And Claire noticed that the change he counted was more than the price on the small chalkboard. He made up the difference without commentary, without pausing the conversation, as if it were simply arithmetic and not generosity. She watched from the far side of the entrance for a moment before going in. During her 9:30, she asked her assistant, a methodical young man named Graham, to find out who the man with the sandwich table was. Graham asked no questions. He understood that Claire's requests were not invitations to discuss their motivation, and came back at 11 with a brief. Daniel Mercer, 36. No criminal record. No current business registration. Previously, co-founder and chief technology officer of a software company called Meridian Systems. Dissolved 3 years ago through what appeared to be, from the public record, a hostile and complicated internal dissolution. Before Meridian, a stint at 2 other firms, solid reviews. One daughter, Lily, age 8. Current address was in a building 12 minutes from the tower. Claire read this twice. Then she set it aside and went back to the compliance crisis. But she found herself, over the following days, watching him the way she sometimes watched the market, not actively, but with the peripheral awareness of someone who has decided a variable is worth tracking. She saw him from the window once when the angle was right. She walked past his table on 2 occasions without stopping and registered. Each time, the unhurried way he moved, the way he listened to people before he responded. On the 4th day, she saw the altercation. She had come down to the lobby for a meeting with the building's facilities manager, a mundane errand she would normally have delegated, but had taken herself because she needed to move her body and think. Through the lobby glass, she watched as a man in a suit. She recognized Trevor Shields, director of corporate communications, a man she had never quite trusted and was currently trusting even less, leaned over Daniel's table and spoke in the way that men who are used to being obeyed speak to people they consider unimportant. Daniel listened. He nodded once. He began packing up the cooler. He wasn't protesting. He wasn't arguing. He was simply complying. With a quietness that was not the quietness of defeat, but of a man who had decided this hill was not worth the cost. Something hot moved through Claire's chest. She identified it, because she was precise about her interior states. It was anger. Not the managed, strategic anger she used in boardrooms. Something raw. Something personal. She turned and went back upstairs. The meeting was at 2. Claire called it with 36 hours notice, which in the Whitmore group meant it was important. Trevor Shields arrived at 2:01, with the faint confidence of a man who believed his position protected him from certain kinds of conversations. He sat across from Claire's desk in the chair that was positioned to be slightly lower than hers, not by accident, and smiled with his teeth. "Claire, I assume this is about the Q3. It's about the vendor arrangement outside the building," Claire said. The smile recalibrated. "The sandwich cart? I had facilities move him on." He was, "Under whose authority?" A pause. I have discretionary oversight of building presentation. It's part of that authority covers the building interior and property line signage. It does not extend to public pavement, and it does not cover your judgment about what represents appropriate building presentation without my sign-off. She picked up a single sheet of paper and placed it on the desk facing him. "This is a memo clarifying those lines. You'll acknowledge receipt by end of day." Trevor looked at the memo. "This is about one sandwich guy? This is about you making decisions outside your scope," Claire said. "The sandwich guy is incidental." He took the memo. After he left, Claire sat alone for a moment. Then she asked Graham to arrange for someone to inform the vendor outside that his previous arrangement stood, and that there would be no further interference. Graham did not comment on this. The next morning, when she came through the glass doors, Daniel's table was there again. He glanced up when she approached, and she saw in his eyes the brief recalibration of someone encountering an unexpected variable. She kept walking, but at the doors, she paused without quite stopping, without turning around, and said, "The egg salad was good." She heard, behind her, the very brief and genuine sound of a person almost smiling. He started talking to her on a Tuesday. It was not planned. She came by at 7:50, which had become, without announcement, her typical time early enough that the morning crowd hadn't yet thickened. She was on the phone. She made a gesture with 2 fingers that he had learned meant the usual. He pulled out the turkey and sharp cheddar, which she had bought 3 times now, which he had accordingly begun setting aside. She finished the call. She looked at the sandwich. She didn't leave immediately. "You used to work in tech," she said. It wasn't a question. "I did. Meridian Systems." He paused. He wasn't disturbed by the fact that she'd looked into him. He'd have been more surprised if she hadn't. She was the kind of person who looked into things. "That's right. It went bad." "It did. How?" He looked at her for a moment. Most people didn't ask directly. They offered sympathetic phrasings. "I heard it was complicated. Those things happen." She asked how, because she wanted to know the mechanism, not the emotion. "My co-founder and I disagreed on direction," he said. "I wanted to stay independent." He found external partners who agreed with him. Those partners had more leverage than I'd anticipated. And by the time I understood what was happening, the ownership structure had been redrawn. "Meaning you were pushed out." "Meaning I was pushed out." She considered this. Who were the external partners? He named the holding company. Something shifted in her face. Not dramatically, she was not a person of dramatic shifts, but her eyes went very still for a moment, in the way that a calculation goes still when a new variable arrives and changes the answer. "I know that name," she said. "Most people in finance do. They're involved in a matter I'm currently navigating." He didn't say anything. He waited, because he had learned that waiting was often the most useful thing. "They're patient," she said, more to herself than to him. "They establish positions slowly. They look for internal fractures and widen them from inside." "Yes," he said. She looked at him. "You've seen the playbook." "I've lived the playbook." She paid for the sandwich. She walked to the glass doors. She stopped before going in and turned back just far enough to look at him over her shoulder. "What time do you close up?" she said. "Noon." She nodded once and went inside. At 11:50, Graham appeared at the table and said that Miss Whitmore asked whether Daniel Mercer would be available to speak briefly at 12:15. Daniel said that he would. They met in a conference room on the 38th floor, not Claire's office. This, Daniel understood, was deliberate, neutral ground, or as close to it as you could get in someone else's building. Patricia Holt was there too, seated to Claire's left with a yellow legal pad and the demeanor of a person who trusts their client's instincts even when they don't yet have the full picture. Claire laid it out efficiently. The compliance challenge. The board members. The external pressure coming from directions that didn't quite make sense until you looked at who was connected to whom. When she named the holding company as one of the external connections, Daniel felt the recognition move through him like cold water. "They'll have a local proxy," he said. "Somebody on the inside who looks clean. Somebody you've known long enough to have stopped questioning." Claire and Patricia exchanged a glance. "How long did it take them to move on Meridian?" Claire asked. "From first contact to the restructure?" "About 14 months. We're at 11, Patricia said quietly. Daniel thought for a moment. He drew a shape on the edge of Patricia's legal pad, not with permission, just reaching for the nearest paper, a rough diagram of the structure he'd seen play out before. The way the external position established itself first, the way internal disagreements were identified and encouraged, the way the compliance element arrived last, because compliance was the instrument, not the motive. "They don't want the company," he said. "They want an asset inside it. Something in your portfolio that becomes accessible to them if the leadership changes." Claire went very still. "The Heron Fund. What is that?" "A position we took 18 months ago. Real estate and infrastructure across 3 cities. It's currently undervalued on paper, but in 18 months it won't be undervalued," Daniel said. "No, and if your leadership is challenged and a transition period opens up, the board votes on asset management protocols during transitional leadership. A simple majority can reallocate management rights." She said it flatly, with the tone of a person reading a sentence they had written and only now understood. Patricia said, We need to know who the inside person is, Daniel thought. Who changed their behavior in the last year? Who became slightly more cautious around you? Or slightly warmer, either direction? Not dramatically, just a degree. Claire was quiet for a long moment. Then she said a name. Neither Daniel nor Patricia spoke. They let her sit with it. I promoted him 8 months ago, she said. He asked for more access to portfolio management. I gave it to him because his work justified it, which gave him visibility into the Heron Fund timeline. Yes, outside the window, the city went about its afternoon. Trucks moved below. A cloud crossed the sun. What do we do? Claire asked. And the question was not the question of a person who had lost their footing. It was the question of a person who had found solid ground and wanted to know the fastest route forward from here. We let them think they're still on schedule, Daniel said. We build the documentation. We establish the trail that shows the coordination. And then we choose the moment. Patricia wrote something on her legal pad. Claire looked at Daniel. You've done this before, she said, from the other side. I watched it happen to me and understood it too late, he said. I've had 3 years to understand it the rest of the way. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, slowly, with the decisiveness of a person closing a chapter. All right, she said. Let's build the case. What followed was 3 weeks of the most careful and methodical work Daniel had done in years. He was not employed by the Whitmore Group. There was no contract, no title, no badge. He came in through the side entrance at Patricia's arrangement, spent 4 hours in the afternoon in a conference room that was never booked under his name, and left before the evening security rotation changed. He bought coffee from a cart 2 blocks away and brought it in a paper cup with no sleeve. He didn't mind the arrangement. He had always done better when the work was the work and the structure around it was invisible. Patricia handled the legal architecture. Claire managed the day-to-day operation of the company without a single detectable change in her behavior. Going to meetings, reviewing reports, speaking to board members with the same measured authority she always deployed. Watching her hold the line while knowing what was building underneath it, Daniel thought, this is what genuine composure looks like. Not the absence of pressure, the decision not to let pressure show until it serves a purpose. He had watched Claire do this for a week before he said anything about it. On the 8th day, as they were wrapping up an afternoon session, he said, You're good at this. She looked up from the document she was reviewing. At what? Carrying a weight that other people don't know is there. Most people at your level either collapse under it or overcorrect. They become too controlled, too precise. And it shows in exactly the way they're trying to hide it. He capped his pen. You just keep working. She was quiet for a moment. I don't have another option. You always have another option. You choose not to take them. That's different. She looked at him steadily. He was used to that look now, the look of a person who has had very few people in their life who said true things plainly, and who was calibrating whether to trust the plainness or wait for the angle. You're doing it again, she said. Doing what? Saying something that I don't know how to dismiss. He picked up his papers. I'll try to be more dismissible tomorrow. That was the closest they came, in those weeks, to anything that wasn't the work. The man Claire had named was Bradford Ellison, her VP of Portfolio Operations, 44, Harvard MBA. 15 years in the industry. He had begun, Daniel confirmed, receiving communications through a secondary email address not found through hacking, but through a simple pattern cross-reference in the company's legal correspondence that Patricia had the standing to access. The communications were careful. But careful wasn't the same as invisible. The pattern was identical to what Daniel had seen at Meridian. First, the position was established externally quiet, patient. No obvious footprint. Then contact was made with someone internal who had access to the specific asset in question, not the whole company. They never needed the whole company. They only needed the one thing, and they only needed the door opened at the right moment by the right pair of hands. At Meridian, it had been the CFO. A man Daniel had trusted implicitly. They had known each other since graduate school. Had played racquetball on Tuesday evenings. had been in each other's weddings. The CFO had not been malicious. He had been convinced, gradually, that the external partner's vision was simply better, was the future, and that Daniel was the obstacle to something good rather than the founder of something worth protecting. By the time Daniel understood what had happened, the legal documents were signed, and the story was already written in a language that excluded him. He had spent a long time not being angry about it, or rather, being angry and then choosing, daily, not to let the anger govern. Anger was useful for about 10 minutes of understanding. After that, it was just weather. Now, looking at Bradford Ellison's access logs and communication timestamps, he felt something that was not anger and not satisfaction, but was perhaps the particular clarity of a person who has studied a pattern long enough to know it by shape. They built the file. One morning, during the window between his sandwich work and his afternoon sessions at the tower, Daniel sat in the small park near his apartment with Lily, who was on spring break and eating a peanut butter sandwich beside him on the bench. She was reading a book about deep-sea creatures and occasionally showed him illustrations without commentary, as though the images spoke for themselves. He watched her read. He thought, this is what it was for. Not the vindication, not the reversal of what had been done to him. This moment. The light on her hair, the illustration of an anglerfish, she turned toward him with wide eyes. He thought, I have not wasted these 3 years, even if they looked like waste from the outside. The morning she showed him the anglerfish, she also said, Is the sandwich lady your friend? He looked at her. What sandwich lady? Graham told Mrs. Halloran you were doing work with someone from the building. And Mrs. Halloran asked who, and Graham said she was the boss lady of the building. And I said she must be the sandwich lady because you always talk about the sandwiches. Daniel was quiet for a moment. I talk about the sandwiches? You said the building was interesting, and the people in it were interesting, and the most interesting thing about interesting people is what they do with their first 10 seconds. Lily turned a page. That's what you said. So I call her the sandwich lady. She's not my friend, he said. Not exactly. Not yet. What is she? He thought about it. Someone who took a long time to trust people, and is deciding whether to trust someone new. Lily considered this. Like the anglerfish, she said, showing him the page again. It goes into the dark, and puts out a light to see what comes toward it. Daniel looked at the illustration. Yes, he said, exactly like that. He walked her home and made her lunch, and spent 20 minutes doing fractions with her at the kitchen table, because her teacher had assigned a worksheet due Monday. Lily approached fractions with the same methodical intensity she brought to everything, not gifted, exactly, but thorough. She didn't move to the next problem until she fully understood the previous one. And she asked questions without embarrassment when she didn't understand, which Daniel thought was a quality that would serve her in every way that mattered. He thought, I don't know how I raised someone this good. Then he thought, it wasn't raising. It was just being around, just being present and letting her see who you were, and trusting that who you were was someone worth showing. That was the whole work of it, when you stripped everything else away. He was back in the Whitmore building by 2:30. Patricia had found 3 new communication records while he was gone, and they spent the afternoon placing them in the timeline with the careful attention of people who understood that a case only holds if every link in the chain is unassailable. By 5 o'clock, they had what they needed. Tomorrow, Daniel said. Day after, Patricia said. Let me have the attorneys verify the access logs. I want it airtight before we set the date. He nodded. He gathered his papers. At the door of the conference room, he paused. Patricia, he said. When this is over, she'll be fine, Patricia said, without looking up from her notes. She's been fine through harder things than this. He considered this. That's not what I was going to ask. She looked up then. There was a brief assessment in her eyes, and then something that might have been approval. No, she said. I suppose it wasn't. She looked back at her notes. She'll be better. That's closer to what you were asking. He left the building through the side entrance. The evening was cold and sharp, and the streetlights had come on early because of the clouds. He walked the 6 blocks home and thought about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of preparation. The meeting was called for a Thursday morning. Full board. The agenda, circulated by Bradford Ellison through standard channels. Standard. Expected. The kind of meeting no one looked at twice. It was not a quarterly governance review. What Bradford had arranged and what Claire, Daniel, and Patricia had watched him arrange through the correspondence chain they had been quietly accumulating was the opening move of the leadership review. The compliance documentation had been prepared by the external entity and was to be introduced through a board member named Raymond Cross, who had been on the Whitmore board for 6 years and whom Claire had, until recently, considered an ally. Daniel arrived through the side entrance at 6:45 in the morning. Patricia was already there, 2 cups of coffee on the conference table, and a drive containing everything they had built in her hand. Claire arrived at 7:15. She looked the way she always looked, coat, heels, the economy of motion of someone who has nowhere to be but here. She sat down. She looked at the drive in Patricia's hand. "Everything's there?" she said. "Everything," Patricia said. "Daniel." Claire looked at him. "When this opens, I want you to present the technical documentation, the ownership structure, the communication chain, the timeline of coordination. Not me, not Patricia, you." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not an employee. You're a witness. You're a primary source. You lived the prior version of this." She held his gaze. "They will try to dismiss what I say as self-interest. They will try to dismiss Patricia as an advocate. You are neither of those things. You are someone who has no stake in the outcome except the truth." This was not quite accurate. He had watched what this company's adversary had done to him and to 3 years of his life, but he understood what she meant. "All right," he said. The board meeting started at 9. For the first 20 minutes, it proceeded as Bradford expected. Raymond Cross introduced the compliance matter with the smooth fluency of a prepared speaker. He was good at it. Daniel, watching from his seat along the wall, noted that the preparation was evident in places that preparation shouldn't show, the pauses that were too measured, the transitions that were too clean. A person speaking from genuine concern is slightly disorganized. Raymond Cross was not disorganized. When Cross finished, Claire said, "Before the board responds to this matter, I'd like to introduce documentation that contextualizes its origins." She nodded to Daniel. He stood. He had not spoken in a boardroom in 3 years. He had not worn a jacket to anything in 3 years. He felt, briefly, the strangeness of the distance he had traveled from this kind of room to a folding table on the pavement, and back to this kind of room through a series of events so improbable that he might have dismissed the story if someone else had told it to him. He looked at the room. 8 board members, 2 attorneys on the side, Bradford Ellison, calm and positioned, with the particular ease of a man who has not yet been told that the trap has swung around. Daniel thought of Lily's worksheet on fractions. He thought of the kitchen light at 4 in the morning. He thought of a rainy day and a woman who had stopped walking. He thought, none of that is in this room. All of it brought me here. Then he began. He spoke for 11 minutes. He described the holding company, its methodology, and the pattern he had seen used against Meridian. He presented the communication records. He walked through the timeline in which Bradford Ellison had accessed specific portfolio information, cross-referenced it with the coordination dates, and presented the structure that showed, clearly, that the compliance matter before the board had been manufactured from the outside and introduced through the inside. The room was silent in the way that rooms are silent when the air has changed. Bradford Ellison said, at last, This person has no standing here. He's a witness presenting documented evidence." Patricia said from her seat, "You're welcome to address the evidence directly. The communications log, the timeline, the access records, any of them specifically." Bradford did not address them specifically. Raymond Cross looked at the table in front of him. He had the face of a man recalculating, and the calculation was coming out badly. He had been on the Whitmore board for 6 years, had attended every Christmas party, had sent a handwritten note when Claire's father passed. That history did not disappear in a room like this, but it also didn't help him. It just made the silence between them more specific. The board chair, A woman named Sylvia Grant, who had been with the Whitmore Group since its restructuring, and who Daniel had assessed, in his 3 weeks, as someone who had not known what was happening and would be furious when she did, leaned forward and said, "I want Patricia Holt, an outside counsel, to walk through this documentation in full, before we proceed further with any governance review." Bradford started to speak. "Bradford," Sylvia said. "I would sit very quietly right now if I were you." Bradford sat quietly. Daniel looked at Claire. She was looking at the table. Her face was very controlled, but he could see, just at the edge of it, something that was not triumph, something more complicated, more tired, more specific to a person who had spent months carrying something alone and was watching it, at last, set down. He thought, "She'll cry later. Not now. She would not allow now. But somewhere private, she would let it move through her. And that would be a good thing." He hoped she had someone to call. He thought, maybe she will. The silence that followed was not the silence of an empty room. It was the silence of something that had been about to happen and had instead stopped, held in place by 11 minutes of a man speaking clearly from a folding table's worth of patience and 3 years of understanding. The external entity quietly withdrew its position over the following weeks, as external entities do when their instruments fail and the light falls on the mechanism. Bradford Ellison resigned. Raymond Cross announced he would not be seeking reappointment to the board. 3 attorneys had a series of conversations that Daniel was not privy to and did not ask about. The Whitmore Group continued. The Heron Fund appreciated in value the following quarter, as projected. Claire did not immediately change. Daniel would not have expected her to, and would not have wanted her to change. Of the real kind is not immediate, and people who claim it is are describing something else. But she changed in the ways that matter. Slowly, in the right direction, for the right reasons. She started eating lunch. This sounds trivial, but Patricia later told Daniel that Claire had, for the previous 4 years, eaten at her desk 90% of the time, working through the midday hour because sitting still with nothing to occupy her hands felt like an exposure she couldn't defend against. The fact that she began walking down to a small restaurant 2 blocks from the tower and sitting at a table by the window for 45 minutes meant something that the behavioral observation alone couldn't fully carry. She also stopped being so afraid of being wrong about people. This was slower. It manifested in the way she began asking questions in meetings, where before she would have made decisions not because she was less decisive, but because she was learning to treat other people's information as information rather than threat. Patricia noticed it. Graham noticed it. Daniel noticed it when he was around. Which was increasingly. He had, in the end, accepted a role with the company. Not as an employee. That conversation had happened twice, and he had deflected it twice, not out of pride but because he genuinely wasn't sure he wanted the thing he'd lost handed back to him in the same form. What he'd agreed to, eventually, was a consulting arrangement. 4 days a week. His own hours, and he kept the sandwich table, because it was his and because it worked, and because Lily would have been disappointed if he'd stopped. The table was, if anything, doing better. Word had gotten around the way word gets around in a building's ecosystem, from the front desk, to the security team, to the junior analysts, who brought breakfast back from the coffee shops, that the guy outside was not just a guy outside. People stopped by not just for sandwiches but to talk, briefly, in the way that people talk to someone they've decided is worth talking to. Daniel was the same with all of them. Unhurried. Attentive. He asked questions and remembered the answers the next day. On a Friday afternoon in late October, Claire came out at 12:40. The table was still up because Daniel had had a late morning. She stood in front of it in her coat, looking at the day-old sourdough options with the slight frown she deployed when considering things. "You still close at noon?" she said. "Theoretically, I want to eat outside. It's 42 degrees. I'm aware." She picked up a sandwich turkey, sharp cheddar, the one he kept for her without saying he kept it, and pulled out the folding chair he kept leaning against the table for situations that required it, and sat down. Daniel looked at her for a moment. Then he took out the last sandwich from the cooler egg salad with dill and sat on the edge of the table. They ate in the cold air without talking for a while. The city moved around them. A taxi horn, 2 blocks away. The sound of someone's phone. The particular quality of autumn light in a city that turns everything slightly gold and slightly old at the same time. "Why did you offer me that sandwich?" Claire said. That first day, Daniel thought about it. "You looked like someone who'd forgotten that the world had things in it that weren't trying to cost you something." She was quiet for a moment. "That's an extraordinary observation to make about a stranger." "I'm observant." "You are." She looked at the sandwich in her hands. "I'd forgotten," she said. Not to him, quite. To herself. Or to the air. "I'd genuinely forgotten." He didn't say anything. "I'm better at remembering now," she said. A pigeon landed near the table, reconsidered its options, and left. "Lily asked about you again," Daniel said. "What did she ask?" "Whether the sandwich lady was coming to dinner." Claire looked at him. He kept his face very calm, because he was a man who did not make things into performances. "Is that an invitation?" she said. "It's a report of what my 8-year-old asked. What you do with it is your decision." She looked at him for a long moment, and then something happened that Graham would have photographed if he'd been there to witness it, and that Patricia would have quietly celebrated, and that no one who had only seen Claire Whitmore in a boardroom would have recognized as belonging to her. She smiled. Not the controlled, measured professional acknowledgement, an actual smile, the kind that comes from somewhere uncalculated. "Saturday," she said. "What time?" 6:30. "Lily goes to bed at 8:30. So come hungry." "What does she like to talk about?" "Currently, deep-sea creatures. Specifically, the anglerfish." Claire considered this. "I know things about anglerfish." "Of course you do." She finished the sandwich. She folded the wax paper into a neat square and placed it in the small recycling bin he kept beside the table. She stood up, buttoned her coat, and looked at him one more time. "No one offered me anything without an angle in a very long time," she said. "Before you." Daniel looked up at her. "I know. Why didn't you have one?" He thought of Lily on the bench with her book. He thought of 4 in the morning, and the kitchen light, and 22 sandwiches laid out in the quiet. He thought of what it had taken to get from the thing that had been done to him to here, and what it had cost, and what he'd learned in the paying. "Because I'd already lost everything I'd tried to hold on to by gripping too hard," he said. "And I found out that when you stop trying to own things, situations, outcomes, people, you sometimes end up with more than you had before." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm working on that," she said. "I know," he said. "You're doing well." She walked through the glass doors. He packed up the cooler. He folded the table. He stood for a moment in the cold air and looked up at the tower and the sky behind it, which was the particular blue that October makes over cities. And he thought, this is enough. More than enough. This is the kind of thing that doesn't require a word for it. Then he picked up the cooler and walked toward home. The apartment was small and warm, and smelled like garlic and something roasting. Lily answered the door in her pajamas. It was Saturday, which she had declared a pajama day at 9 in the morning, and which Daniel had not contested, and looked up at Claire with the frank evaluating gaze of a child who has decided to assess a situation before committing. "You're the sandwich lady," Lily said. "I suppose I am," Claire said. "Dad says you're interesting. He's been generous." "He's not generous about it," Lily said seriously. "He only says someone is interesting when they actually are. He didn't say the man from the water company was interesting. He said he was persistent." Claire looked over Lily's shoulder to where Daniel was visible in the kitchen, not facing them, doing something with a pan, and pretending not to be listening. "That's a good distinction," Claire said. "Do you know about anglerfish? I know that the male is much smaller than the female, and that he fuses to her body to survive." Lily's eyes widened. "That's the best part. Come in." She opened the door wider, and Claire stepped inside. The table was set for 3. The candle was short and practical, not the decorative kind. Lily had put one of her drawings in the center, a fish with a glowing lamp hanging from its head, which she had labeled in careful handwriting, "Angler fish, deep sea." Daniel came out of the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder and looked at them. Coat? He said to Claire. She took it off and handed it to him. He hung it on the peg by the door next to his dark jacket and Lily's small yellow one and went back to the kitchen. Lily had already settled into her chair and was explaining the feeding behavior of deep-sea creatures with the authority of someone who has done extensive research. Claire sat across from her and listened the way she had learned to listen when the information mattered. Without performing attention, without planning the next thing she would say. Just actually listening. From the kitchen, there was the sound of a wooden spoon against a pan. The light was warm, outside. Somewhere in the city, someone was probably already up to something that would need to be carefully countered. Some position being established in the dark. Some instrument being readied. The world was full of those things and always would be. But the world was also full of this. A small table, a child explaining the deep sea, and the particular smell of garlic in a warm kitchen. And a woman who had learned, late and at some cost, that a thing offered without angle was still a real thing. Maybe the rarest kind. Lily said, "Did you know the anglerfish makes its own light?" Claire said, "I did. Dad says that's the best way to find things in the dark. Make your own light instead of waiting for someone else's." Claire was quiet for a moment. "Your dad is very smart," she said. "I know," said Lily simply. "That's why I told you about him." Dinner was roast chicken with garlic and a green salad and bread from the day-old bakery on 5th, which Claire noted was excellent, and which Daniel did not explain the origin of. Lily talked for the better part of 40 minutes about the deep sea, which was more comprehensive a subject than most adults appreciated. The pressure differentials, the bioluminescence, the creatures that had evolved in perfect darkness and had no need for eyes, and had replaced sight with sensation and electrical reading of water. Claire asked questions with genuine interest, not the performed interest of an adult tolerating a child, but the specific questions of someone who had encountered an unfamiliar subject and wanted to understand its structure. Lily noticed the difference. She always noticed. At 8:15, Lily said goodnight to Claire with the gravity of someone conferring something, and went down the hallway. Daniel went through the routine lights. The small lamp she kept on because darkness was acceptable, but total darkness was not. The glass of water on the nightstand. 3 minutes of reading from the book of sea creature facts. She kept specifically for bedtime, which she called her settling book. He came back to the kitchen to find Claire washing up at the sink, unhurried, as if she had decided this was simply what happened next. He stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know." She didn't stop. "I wanted to." He came and stood beside her and dried what she washed, and they didn't talk for a while. And the kitchen was warm and small, and the window above the sink showed the street outside with its ordinary light. Some things start with something small. A sandwich on a rainy morning. A stranger who looked at you and didn't need anything back. The world is very large, and most of it is moving fast and taking aim. But sometimes, not often, not reliably, not on a schedule you can plan for, something simple crosses the distance between one person and another. And it turns out that was the whole mechanism. That was what was needed all along. Just that.